It's their choice, right? Premier Moe, myself, we're deciding to take a different avenue when it comes to the carbon tax.
Provinces are able to address global climate change and emissions in their jurisdiction in any way that they choose.
You know, notwithstanding people's claims to the contrary, we're actually in a position now in Alberta where for the second year in a row, we're leading economic growth in the country. That's happening in the face of our application of the levy.
Three different premiers with different views on a national carbon pricing plan. They were speaking at the final news conference of the Council of the Federation meeting today in New Brunswick. The provinces and territories found agreement on some issues like easing interprovincial trade barriers. But as you just heard, there is no consensus when it comes to carbon pricing. Let's get a sense of where both of these issues are headed from those who've debated, discussed, and made the tough decisions themselves. We are bringing back the Premiers League today. Former BC Premier Christy Clark joins us from Vancouver. And in Halifax, former Nova Scotia Premier Darrell Dexter. I want to say thank you and welcome to you both. And Ms. Clark, I'm going to start with you. We are 6 weeks away from the federal government's deadline, and most of the provinces are not compliant with the criteria that the federal government wants imposed on the carbon pricing plan. From your perspective, is the Prime Minister's plan dead at this point?
I think it's going to be tough for them to bring in a national carbon plan. I've never really believed this idea that this was a national carbon plan anyway, though, because the cap and trade system isn't the equivalent of BC's carbon tax, and there's an intensity target in Alberta. It's kind of apples and oranges. Some provinces sort of got a pass and have more or less opted out. The North isn't in. It's not right to characterize it as a national plan, but I think the feds have been very heavy-handed in this, and I think this was an expected outcome. It's just going to make it harder for them, though, now that Saskatchewan is joined by the Ford government in Ontario.
Mr. Dexter, what's your take on that? Do you agree with that assessment? Is this plan not going to be able to move forward?
No, I think it will. I think it will move forward. I think if there was going to be a change in the message from the federal government, then they would have changed the messenger when they had their most recent cabinet shuffle. And obviously, Minister McKenna is staying. She's made it clear that they intend to go forward. And I think there are other kinds of benefits for the federal government. They're a year away from another election or so. Part of the coalition that they put together last time were progressives for whom the environment was very important. And frankly, they've looked a little wobbly on that file in the last little while. So I think there's a political benefit, actually, to be standing up on climate change, on environmental issues for the federal government. So I don't expect they're going to back off this at all. I guess if the question is whether or not they'll be successful, I think that's another question. It undoubtedly will be. It would be better if you had provinces on board and they were willing to take the same approach. But I think the federal government's in a position to make things pretty uncomfortable for those provinces that decide they're going to balk at what is, I think, a central plank of the platform from the last election.
Now, PEI is the latest province to say it wants to take another approach to reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but there are several others proposing plans that fall short of what the federal government is asking for. What are the repercussions if the federal government penalizes provinces that are moving on emissions reductions but don't perhaps do enough? Ms. Clark, can we start with you there?
I think there are huge political implications for it. Nobody likes to see provinces and the federal government fighting. I think people are very concerned about competitiveness in this country now, that the Trump government has dropped their taxes, and they've just become, and we are in the midst of a serious trade war. And so, I think the federal government has been very heavy-handed, unnecessarily so. I don't think they did their homework on what a carbon tax needs to look like, because in British Columbia, I support carbon taxes, but I don't support it dumped on top of the rest of the economy. You have to use it to make the rest of your economy more tax competitive by reinvesting all of it in other tax cuts. And if you want to see an example of where the federal government wants something, but a province, just one province stands in the way, look at Trans Mountain. British Columbia government doesn't have a constitutional leg to stand on, and they are still stalling that project. I think that Premier Moe and Premier Ford do have a good constitutional argument, and I think they're going to be in a position to really gum this up. I think Darryl's right. The feds aren't backing off. Keeping Catherine McKenna in her position in the cabinet is an indication of that. But I don't think they're going to get to be able to do it, not over the objections of the provinces.
Mr. Dexter, what's your take on that? Ms. Clark says she thinks that Premier Moe, Premier Ford might have a good constitution, might have something to stand on, might have a case here. Do you agree with that assessment?
Well, I haven't seen the details of the case that they put forward, but certainly what I was taught on my way through law school was that the constitutional power of the federal government when it comes to taxation is absolute. So, I can't, certainly the attack on it couldn't be from that perspective. I'm a person who personally supported and do support the goals that were laid out in the so-called Vancouver Declaration, but it is really a question of approach. Interestingly enough, you might think this would be otherwise, but I wasn't particularly supportive of the notion of carbon tax because I thought that the way that those were implemented tried to treat all of the provinces as if they were in an equal position, and that's just not the case. In fact, the highest energy costs in the country are in Atlantic Canada. When you layer in carbon, a price on carbon on top of that, then it makes regions like Atlantic Canada all that much more uncompetitive. So I support decarbonizing the economy, trying to find ways to bring down greenhouse gas emissions. We did that in Nova Scotia with a very clear strategy. It's one of the reasons why we have an equivalency agreement with the federal government. But I guess I would. I'm not sure that you can attack it on a constitutional ground with respect to the question of a tax.